Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 16, Section 1, Truman and Eisenhower. And we're going to get into talking about post-war America. And as you can see kind of in the center of our slide here, we have a illustration here from the Saturday Evening Post, which was a widely read publication during the middle part of the 20th century. Most noted Saturday Evening Post illustrators was a guy named Norman Rockwell. But the irony here, or at least the pun that was supposed to be going on, was how hard suburban life had become. The fact that everybody had these wonderful new homes and these wonderful new cars that, at some point in time, all this goodness is going to have at least a little sourness to it. And this whole idea that the suburbs were maybe a little more cramped than maybe what people had thought. So take a look at number one. After the war, many Americans worried that as the military production halted, millions of former soldiers glutted the labor market. Along with that, unemployment and recession might sweep the nation. Well, the truth is, some of that did happen. Following 1945, the country did dip into a little recession from 45 into 46. And part of that was there were a lot of people who had been working in war industries that were being laid off. Women who had been kind of Rosie the Riveters during the Second World War were given pink slips and sent home. And so our country kind of slipped into a recession. And the goal here was to kind of get the economy back onto kind of a post-war footing. And so we were going to have to do some different things. Along with that fear that perhaps maybe labor might maybe go out and start striking and things like that, members of Congress, particularly Republicans, passed a piece of legislation known as the Taft-Hartley Act. This act did a lot of different things. Sometimes it's known as the Labor Management Relations Act of 1947. One of the things that kind of brought this about is the fear of labor unions calling upon their workers and union members to go out and strike. During the Second World War, there had been an agreement between labor and management not to strike, during the wartime. And for the most part, everybody kind of held true to that. But when the war ends, the gloves come off. So this act, for the most part, would probably put a little bit of pressure on labor unions. Truth be it, when this act actually went into impact, it really had kind of a minor effect. It didn't necessarily hurt the labor unions as much as they probably were thinking it would. But needless to say, this act did a lot of things. And one of the things that it did, it was outlawed the practice of forcing employers to hire only union members. Sometimes this is known as a closed shop, meaning that, to even be eligible for a job, you had to join the labor union first. What could happen is you could use like a union shop and say, okay, we'll hire a worker, but upon your hiring, then you might have to join the union to make everybody happy. Needless to say, when this act went through Congress, it passed both houses. It went to the president to be signed. Harry Truman vetoed it. And unlike some vetoes, this is one of these rare occasions where the president's veto was overridden by Congress. And much to the chagrin of maybe Harry Truman, this act actually became law. One of the things that did help labor, and it was kind of a roundabout kind of deal, and it kind of takes place before the war actually even ends, was a piece of legislation that's popularly known as the GI Bill of Rights. Originally, it was called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, but this was an act that hopefully was going to help kind of spur our economy in the post-war era. And it really did. To be eligible for this act, a soldier had to be in active duty for at least 90 days and not dishonorably discharged from the military. And the four things that this piece of legislation came to promise, and these are things that you will need to write down, was that it provided an opportunity for our GIs to go to college, to get an education. So if an individual wanted to go to a 2 year technical school or a 4 year school, or maybe even just take a 1 year training course, all of that would be covered by this Bill of Rights. Okay, and it would be paid for. But by 1956, so roughly 10 years after this bill really kind of gets used, there are roughly 7 million, almost 8 million Americans who took advantage of this. About 2.2 million used this for a 4 year college education, while about a little less than maybe 6 million actually used it for training programs. In my family, my grandfather used it as a training program in agriculture, but his brother and his brothers-in-laws actually went to 4 year colleges. And out of that, we had in my family a professor, a cardiologist, a veterinarian, and a psychologist, all because of this GI Bill of Rights. It really did a lot to transform our nation. People who had never been given an opportunity to go to college could go to college, and it really improved our economy in the post-war years. Other things that this act did was provide low interest loans. So let's say we had a soldier who came home and they wanted to buy a house. They could get a low interest loan, meaning that they would pay very little interest and be able to buy a home, which maybe if they had not been given this opportunity, they might have had to wait for years to actually save enough money to buy a home. Along with that, employment and compensation. I'd mentioned before that there was a little bit of a recession in those first couple of years right after the war. Some of our soldiers, when they came home, they weren't hired right away, and they needed a little supplemental income to kind of get them by. And that's really what this bill did. It allowed them to have kind of a 90-day grace period that they could have some money coming from the government that would help them get by until they could find a better job. Along with this, rehabilitation care was also provided. We had soldiers that came home that had been injured in combat. What this money would do would be help to either provide for physical therapy, or if an individual lost a limb, to help them get a prosthesis that would help them carry on their daily lives. In 1948, Truman asked Congress to pass a broad civil rights bill that would protect African Americans' right to vote. It would abolish poll taxes and also make lynching a federal crime. And this is kind of the beginning. If you know anything about Truman was from Missouri. His mother actually was a Confederate. And it's kind of interesting to see how far he has come from his probably a little more Southern upbringing to when he's president and he's trying to protect the rights of African Americans. Number 4, Truman also issued an executive order barring discrimination in the federal employment. He also ended segregation in the armed forces and military. All of these are things that kind of fall under what is known as the fair deal, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But certainly, when you talk about a president who was concerned about the rights of the minorities, Truman certainly was one of those advocates for African Americans. Number 5, although Truman's Republican opponent, a man named Thomas Dewey, who happened to be the governor of New York, and the fact that Dewey was a very popular candidate, he was a Republican, well known, Truman was actually able to win the presidential election of 1948 by a narrow margin. He did a lot of campaigning. He did something called whistle stopping, and that's when a candidate gets on a train, and at every whistle stop, meaning that every crossroads of our railroads, our train would stop and the president would come to the back of the train and stand kind of on the near the railing and give a speech. Needless to say, if you look at the photograph of Harry Truman, you might see the headline of the Chicago Daily Tribune saying that Dewey defeated Truman, which obviously is kind of a lark because of the fact that Truman actually did win this election. Number 6, although legislators did not completely support Truman's idea, they did raise the minimum wage. Minimum wage was something that was born out of the New Deal under FDR in the 1930s, and the original minimum wage was 50 cents an hour. Minimum wage under Truman rose to 75 cents an hour. He also increased Social Security benefits. He also extended these benefits to 10 million people who hadn't qualified for them under the New Deal. Congress also passed what is known as the National Housing Act of 1949. Some of this is to make sure that individuals who had been struggling to find good housing or were living in areas where housing was kind of in a shortage, that they would be able to find homes that they could rent or apartments that they could rent at a reasonable price. Truman's Fair Deal, which basically encompasses his civil rights reform, his welfare reform, his labor reforms, basically ended as the war in Korea consumed national attention and resources. Number 9, Dwight Eisenhower ran for president as a Republican nominee in 1952. Eisenhower, for the most part, had never really been a political man when he was a general in the military. Matter of fact, sometimes people thought that he actually was a little more democratic as far as some of his leanings as far as political parties were concerned. But in 1952, he decided to run as a Republican, and he had a lot of name recognition because of all the wonderful things that happened during the Second World War and the fact that Harry Truman was kind of a lame duck. He was leaving office. In 1956, Congress passed what was known as the Federal Highway Act. This is something that was kind of Dwight Eisenhower's pet project, but what this act did was grant about $25 billion to build over 40,000 miles of interstate highways. Got to remember, Eisenhower, being a general that happened to have been in Germany during the Second World War, had seen the Autobahn, and he understood how vital that was as far as moving commerce, but more importantly, moving the military. This is the Cold War. And Eisenhower is concerned about moving troops and perhaps moving mobile missile sites, that this became kind of a national emergency to build this highway system. Nebraska was one of the first states to complete their section of the interstate system. What's interesting is a lot of the overpasses on the interstate were built at such a height that would allow for mobile missile systems to go underneath them. Along with that, for Interstate 80, so many miles of straight highway had to be built just in case the Air Force would ever have to land an aircraft, and they would be able to do so on the interstate highway. Thank you very much.